Welcome to the final lab video for Biology 130A. For this week's lab, we're going to be discussing natural selection. To participate in this week's lab, you're going to complete this online lab video on selection. You're going to also complete the video worksheet that you can find posted on Moodle as part of the assignment. In addition, we're going to ask you to print out the lab handout and bring both the completed worksheet and the lab handout to lab. The objectives for this week's lab are to understand how natural selection works. And to do that, we're going to investigate a couple of different scenarios. First, we're going to try to experience and understand how predators can act as a selective force in natural selection in a predator-prey interaction. Then, we're going to experience how competition itself can act as a selective force in natural selection. And to do this, we're going to incorporate new mutations into a model. So that will allow us to understand how new mutations can change or impact a population when working in combination with natural selection. Now recall from lecture that evolution is simply defined as descent with modification. And this means that there's some pattern of inheritance of certain traits that occurs from parent to offspring and often across many generations. And that for evolution to occur, there is required to be an alteration or an impact on the population, a change in the population over this generational time. Now, populations can change from many different forces. So some of the various mechanisms of evolution that we've learned about in lecture include genetic drift. Genetic drift is going to include these random changes to the genetic frequencies, and these typically occur more often in smaller populations than in larger populations. Also, we know that mutation is a very important driver of change. It's the ultimate source of variation. And although mutation itself may be a weaker force, in combination with drift or selection or one of these other forces, can be very potent, can have very potent effects on the population. Non-random mating is another force that can occur when subgroups start to mate separately from the rest of the population, and we can get instances of inbreeding or very selective mating that can cause parts of the population to change and become different. Migration, it turns out, is another force or mechanism of evolution, but this force tends to counter the force of change between populations. Gene flow, which is migration, can counteract this divergence between populations and actually keep separate populations being more alike and preventing speciation. Alternatively, gene flow that occurs very rarely can actually introduce new alleles or new versions of genes into populations, which can provide increased diversity to that population and allow that population to change. Finally, the one we're going to focus on today, the mechanism of natural selection. This was the mechanism proposed by Charles Darwin, and we can investigate this at a much deeper level in lab. Now, Charles Darwin put forth 4 key ideas, often referred to as the pillars of natural selection, that help us understand how this mechanism of natural selection. The first of these is that there's variation among individuals within a population. Now we know through genetics that this variation can arise through mutation, through genetic recombination and meiosis, and through sexual reproduction and fertilization. That these are the drivers or the components of generating original variation within populations. Also, he noticed that some of the variation is heritable, that offspring often look like their parents and carry some aspects of their traits through the generations. So some of these traits that you might observe in a population are heritable, that is, they're inherited from parents to offspring. The other thing he put forth is that there's population pressure. Now recall that population pressure was the idea that not all offspring will be able to survive and reproduce. And so there's some mechanism then that allows nature to determine which individuals will survive and reproduce and which ones will not. And that aspect of the mechanism turns out to be that individuals that have favorable traits, or favorable variants as Darwin called them, were simply better able to survive and reproduce, or reproduce more than others. And that this would occur in a certain environment, and within that environment, those individuals with favorable variants would be considered to have greater fitness. They'd have greater fitness because they're reproducing more. Those that reproduce more were simply passing on their traits, those favorable traits, to their offspring, and that those offspring are going to be more abundant in the next generation in the population. So these favorable variations or traits that seem to increase fitness are often referred to as adaptive traits or as adaptations. And since fitness is measured, we said, by the production of offspring, and we refer to this as reproductive success, then as you go through subsequent generations, the population will simply have more and more individuals with the adaptive version of the trait compared to the non-adaptive version of the trait. And if a population changes significantly in its variation, then we consider that population to have evolved. Now, natural selection can often be seen very easily in cases where there's predator-prey interactions. A predator-prey interaction is a species interaction where one species is going to serve as the food source for another species, and I'm sure we're all aware that the species that acts as the food source is considered the prey species, and the species that is eating the food source or hunting the food source is considered the predator. Now, predation turns out to provide a very strong selective force that can impact the traits in the prey species, and we'll see the prey species can adapt to this predation force. One way that we see that occurring is through the emergence of something called cryptic coloration. Sometimes people call it camouflaging, but it's a condition where the prey species is going to try to blend into its background. And just thinking of the coloration of this prey species, we might recognize that oftentimes a species coloration will allow its individual in the population to be less detectable, to blend in with their environment more. And when they're less detectable then by the predator species, they're less likely to be eaten. If they're less likely to be eaten, of course, that means they're more likely to survive to reproductive age and produce more offspring. They'll have higher reproductive success. So those individuals that blend in with their background because of their coloration will tend to have more offspring. And as a result, then, we expect that the population will begin to shift and that the cryptic colored species will become more prevalent in the population, and those that have coloration that stand out will become less prevalent in the population. This can be seen very neatly with two butterfly species. Here's one that's adapted to its gray bark background, and here's this different butterfly species that lives in a different habitat, in a different environment, and the version of that butterfly or moth has adapted to a different coloration pattern. So for the first laboratory activity, each student will participate as a predator, and they'll be searching for prey items. In this case, the prey items will be different colored pipe cleaners. Now, how the student does in terms of their hunting success will determine the reproductive success of each of the different prey species. Each of the different prey species will be hunted for in a different type of environment, so there'll be 3 different environments with different background colors, and we'll see how each of the different prey species does in each of these different backgrounds. So what we can do then is we'll evaluate whether each prey species coloration will affect its reproductive success in a given background or in a given environment, with the students acting as predators. Now, to accomplish this activity, the students will work in pairs, and one student will serve as the hunter and the other student will serve as a prey wrangler, and then the students will switch roles. You'll take turns conducting a series of 20-second hunts, and the 20-second hunts will be guided by your laboratory instructor. So your laboratory instructor will coordinate all the hunts for all the participants in the lab. After a hunt, you'll count up each of the prey species that will remain or that survived the hunting process, and you'll record them in your lab handout. Now, how many prey species remain or how they did in terms of surviving the hunt will certainly determine their ability to reproduce in the next generation. So that each student will do 3 generations of hunting, and then we'll pool all of the class data into some final results to see how these hunting expeditions in each of the different habitats might have affected the survival and reproduction of each of the different types of prey species in those habitats. And you'll record that again in your laboratory handout. Now, another scenario where we often see natural selection at work is in regards to competition. Now, competition is an interaction among individuals who are both trying to access the same resource. We often find this playing out when there's competition for food resources. This is a very common scenario for competition. In this case, what we'll notice in populations is that traits that allow individuals to better access food or more efficiently collect the food tend to be adaptive traits. So what we find then, and this often shows up very well in bird species, if we look at their bill morphology, is that The condition of the trait will often depend on the food resource that is being accessed. So in the lecture, we talked about the black-bellied seed crackers. We talked about how the larger billed form tends to be more efficient at eating these large hard seeds, whereas the small pointy billed form of the same species tends to be much more efficient at eating and handling these tiny small seeds. And so they're more efficient on different resources, and that affects how their bill is formed. In the case of shorebirds, we see many different forms of beaks or bills in shorebirds, and that these often can be associated with the food resources that each of these species of shorebirds is going to access. Now recall that mutations are considered to be the ultimate source of variation, and that mutations will add new variants in the population that can increase the population diversity and introduce new forms upon which selection can act. Now, mutations alone are often considered a fairly weak force of evolution because mutation doesn't tend to change the numbers of individuals in the population very quickly. However, working in combination with selection, mutation can be a very powerful force of evolution, or the two of them together, mutation and natural selection, serve to be a very powerful force of evolution. A new mutation for a trait that can impact competition for food can quickly increase that new mutant form within the population and cause the population to change, thereby causing the population to evolve. So, for the second activity, Activity 2, what we're going to view are some adaptations of bird beaks in a pond foraging species. In this case, our pond is going to simply be an aquarium filled to a certain level, and the foraging species are going to be students acting as birds. So initially, all of the students will have short bills. The short bills will consist of a shortened pair of chopsticks, which the students will be able to use to collect food resources from the pond. Now, they can access, with their short bills, prey on the surface of the water. In this case, the prey items will be these little rubber bait forms that will float along the surface of the water. And that will be the food resource, and students will compete with each other to collect food, and then by virtue of how much food they collect, to produce offspring. Now, it turns out that in the course of producing offspring, sometimes mutations can be generated. And in this case, occasionally a mutation for a long-billed form can be generated. And if that happens, the student will now become a bird with a long bill using the longer chopsticks. Now, the long-billed bird actually can access food not only at the surface, but also access food that lives at the bottom. In this case, these are the same types of species that have a mutation, which is to have a weighted sinker added. And they live at the bottom of the pond and can be accessed by the long-billed form. So our goal then is to participate in the activity, and to do that we have to follow a certain set of rules. So for example, in the course of feeding with the chopstick bills, the hands cannot touch the water. These birds don't like to have their feathers in the water for some reason. And then regarding the process of doing the competition, just be sure to follow the instructions in the lab handout and from your laboratory instructor regarding the mutations. They're a little bit complicated, but once you've done them once, you'll be able to figure them out. Finally, just like in the first lab activity, the laboratory instructor will coordinate all of the feeding sessions and keep time for everyone. So one thing that we do ask though is at the end of activity 2, please be sure to dry off all of the prey items when the activity is complete, and this will allow the next lab session to experience a similar process. The final part of the lab will include a review, and for this, we're going to ask that the lab instructors will review with you the answers to the practice questions that are provided online. So hopefully you'll have time to go through some of the practice questions and see if you can figure them out on your own, but if not, please bring them to lab so that you can review them with the laboratory instructors. This will allow us to use this time that's left in lab to have your lab instructor help you to prepare for the final exam. So just to remind ourselves, in order to participate in this week's lab, you've now completed the online selection lab video. Hopefully, through this course of watching this, you've completed the video worksheet, which has been posted online. Now you're going to bring both the completed worksheet and the printed lab handout to lab with you this week to go through these two activities and the review. To do the review then, you probably also want to bring your practice questions to review with the TAs. So hopefully they'll have a good lab. It'll be a little bit more of a fun lab this week, probably not too long, and then you'll begin to prepare for the final exam. I hope you've had a good time in Biology 130A lab, and we'll see you at the exam.